is modeled on fixed structures, on, we might almost say, prefabricated elements. Elements, however, that allow of an enormous number of combinations. Vladimir Propp, in the course of his studies of Russian folk tales, came to the conclusion that all such tales were like variants of a single tale, and could be broken down into a limited number of narrative functions. 40 years later, Claude Lévi-Strauss, working on the myths of the Indians of Brazil, saw these as a system of logical operations between permutable terms, so that they could be studied according to the mathematical processes of combinatorial analysis. Even if the folk imagination is therefore not boundless like the ocean, there is no reason to think of it as being like a water tank of small capacity. On an equal level of civilization, the operations of narrative, like those of mathematics, cannot differ all that much from one people to another. But what can be constructed on the basis of these elementary processes can present unlimited combinations, permutations, and transformations. Is this true only of oral narrative traditions, or can it be maintained of literature in all its variety of forms and complexities? As early as the 1920s, the Russian formalists began to make modern stories and novels the object of their analysis, breaking down their complex structures into functional segments. In France today, the semiological school of Roland Barthes, having sharpened its knives on the structures of advertising or of women's fashion magazines, is at last turning its attention to literature. The 8th issue of the magazine, Communications, was devoted to the structural analysis of the short story. Naturally enough, the material that lends itself best to this kind of treatment is still to be found in the various forms of popular fiction. If the Russians studied the Sherlock Holmes stories, today it is James Bond who provides the structuralists with their most apt exemplars. But this is merely the first step in the grammar and syntax of narrative fiction. The combinatorial play of narrative possibilities soon passes beyond the level of content to touch upon the relationship of the narrator to the material related and to the reader. And this brings us to the toughest set of problems facing contemporary fiction. It is no coincidence that the researches of the French structuralists go hand in hand, and sometimes coexist in the same person, with the creative work of the tel quel group. For the latter, and here I am paraphrasing statements by one of their authorized interpreters, writing consists no longer in narrating, but in saying that one is narrating, and what one says becomes identified with the very act of saying. The psychological person is replaced by a linguistic or even a grammatical person, defined solely by his place in the discourse. These formal repercussions of a literature at the second or third degree, such as occurred in France with the Nouveau Roman of 10 years ago, from which another of its exponents suggested the word scripturalism, can be traced back to combinations of a certain number of logico-linguistic, or better, syntactical-rhetorical operations, in such a way as to be reducible to formulas that are the more general as they become less complex. I will not go into technical details on which I could only be an unauthorized and rather unreliable commentator. My intention here is merely to sum up the situation, to make connections between a number of books I've recently read, and to put these in the context of a few general reflections. In the particular way today's culture looks at the world, one tendency is emerging from several directions at once. The world in its various aspects is increasingly looked upon as discrete rather than continuous. I'm using the term discrete in the sense it bears in mathematics, a discrete quantity being one made up of separate parts. Thought, which until the other day appeared to us as something fluid, evoking linear images such as a flowing river or an unwinding thread, or else gaseous images such as of a kind of vaporous cloud, to the point where it was sometimes called spirit, in the sense of breath, we now tend to think of as a series of discontinuous states, of combinations of impulses acting on a finite, though enormous, number of sensory and motor organs. Electronic brains, even if they are still far from producing all the functions of the human brain, are nonetheless capable of providing us with a convincing theoretical model for the most complex processes of our memory, our mental associations, our imagination, our conscience. Shannon, Wiener, von Neumann, and Turing have radically altered our image of our mental processes. In the place of the ever-changing cloud that we carried in our heads until the other day, the condensing and dispersal of which we attempted to understand by describing impalpable psychological states and shadowy landscapes of the soul, in the place of all this, we now feel the rapid passage of signals on the intricate circuits that connect the relays, the diodes, the transistors with which our skulls are crammed. Just as no